Start. Welcome, everyone. We're here for the Land Trust Practicum second webinar. This is a pre-event webinar, Permanent Affordability 101. We're going to be covering vocabulary and some basics around permanent affordability so that we're all on the same page going into our in-person event, which will be in April. We have a lot to cover today. We will hopefully have some time for Q&A at the end of this session. But today we're going to cover some permanent affordability basics, why it's important. We're going to cover affordability terms, some legal terms, some numbers terms. And then again, we'll have some Q&A at the end. We have a lot to cover though. So we're going to be flying through some of this. And what we want to make sure you know is some of this vocabulary is really complicated and could be a whole training unto itself. So we're not going to cover everything today. And this is just to try to cover and give us some overview terms and make sure that we're all, like I said, on the same page as we go into our deeper learning in April together. With that, because we have so much to cover, I'm gonna pass the mic. We have mainly two presenters today, Julie Brunner and Michelle DeRosa again. But we have some support folks. Katie Ulrich and Don Holden from our last webinar are also here to kind of help and support and answer questions along with us. So I think that will kick us off. And Julie, if you want to kick us off with some of that affordability, let's jump right into the why here.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thanks for coming, everybody. I'm Julie Brunner. I'm up in the tippy top Pacific Northwest on Orcas Island in Washington State. I met many of you last time. I work for Opal Community Land Trust, and I've been doing that for about 25 years. And then I also work part-time. I've done part-time Opal and part-time consulting for my whole career, pretty much. So it's in that consulting capacity that I get to work with groups all across the country, primarily community land trusts, but more and more Habitat for Humanities are interested. And so I'm going to sort of take us through a little bit of the introduction to permanent affordability today. And I just want to highlight that I know some of this won't be new to many of you, but just hopefully may make you a little bit more fluent in talking about it. And I also want to acknowledge that my sister's a physician, and she always said things like, it takes sometimes up to 7 times for people to hear medical information before they can really understand and assimilate it. And I think that that's true in not just medicine, but in all kinds of industries where the language is technical. And so we are going to talk a little bit about the affordability crisis, kind of why we got to permanent affordability and how that works, the kind of basics of how it functions functionally, and then some vocabulary. One of the things that we've learned over the years in doing some of these larger trainings is that we all have words, but we use them in different ways. So when I say price, it means one thing, and when Katie says price, it might mean something different. So we at least want to have a shared common vocabulary as we move into this, the Land Trust Practicum coming up this spring. And we'll have a little bit more kind of detailed information that to share about that towards the end. So I'm going to jump in. Hopefully my screen works. Okay, so I usually like to start by talking about kind of how we got here. So what is the crisis that prompted us to take this shift and this new perspective on how to address the challenges around housing affordability across our country? The sort of case for affordability has been gotten dramatically more acute over the last 5 years. There's kind of these ebbs and flows of interest in permanent affordability as housing costs go up, and then there might be a correction, they come back down. And when housing costs are up here, everybody's interested, then they're slightly less interested, and then they're much more interested. But this last 5 years really has felt different than the previous crisis that we have. So this map shows you what people need to earn to afford an average two-bedroom rental across the country. So if we zoom into Oregon, People need to earn $33 an hour to earn enough to be able to pay for the average two-bedroom rental in the state of Oregon. Now, I know states are big places and that might not be totally applicable to your geography, but that's a lot of money. The other thing to look at it is it's 88 hours of minimum wage work to afford a two-bedroom rental in the state of Oregon. So clearly, our rental housing has a long way to go, and that's made this affordability crisis on the homeownership side feel also more acute because people are just out of options. So if we look at the county median home prices across the country, again, those darker blue to, I don't know what that color is, to red to maroon are the less affordable places, and then the lighter colors are the more affordable places. And if we zoom in again for Oregon with that, you can see um, much of Oregon, at least on the west side, the dark blue starts at $350,000 for median sale price and goes up in that orange zone to 750. So 350 to 750 for the west side of the state. So there's lots of places where even what used to be 5 years ago quite affordable today is really not affordable. And again, I know this is not new information, but is the basis for how we got to this idea of long-term affordability. So I pulled up the numbers for Multnomah County. The median sale price was $562,000 roughly for the county, and the mortgage to afford that home would be $3,300. And a year earlier, about the same, which means just that, interest rates haven't really changed in the past year. They're starting to come down, but, not a dramatic shift in cost. But at the same time that we were seeing these increases, dramatic increases in sale prices, we also saw that dramatic increase in interest rates. So if you were trying to buy that $562,000 home back in 2022, your payment would be dramatically less, 27% less, just because of the interest rate shift. So at the same time that we saw a spike in affordability, in lack of affordability because of COVID and all of the kind of buying up real estate that came along with that, which was a super surprise for many of us. I feel like, we felt like the ceiling, the world was falling down around us. The last thing we thought might happen was everyone would start buying homes, but they did. Um, and at the time, interest rates were still super low. So affordability was improved by that temporarily, and now it's no longer the case. So the other thing that comes up when we're talking about how we got here in terms of permanent affordability is really wealth creation. Because if we were just worried about housing access, we would probably just focus on rental housing. But we recognize in the United States, a family's home is the primary vehicle to create wealth. So this chart just shows you the difference. That flat orange line on the bottom is the average wealth of a renter household, and the blue line across the top is the average wealth of a homeowner household from 2010 to 2019. So you can see a huge gap that's only getting wider as real estate prices increase. And then this, of course, is associated with sort of the racial wealth gap because homeowners are primarily white. I think this slide was from the Habitat Portland website, and it just shows a pretty stark difference between access to homeownership between Black and brown families and white families. And the final piece of this whole picture that led us to permanent affordability was displacement. So, there's a rich history in our country of urban renewal, of, fixing up neighborhoods that resulted in neighborhoods that looked a lot nicer, but none of the faces were recognizable after it had been, revitalized. So often the sort of public investments in infrastructure and housing result in almost wholesale displacement of the people who used to live in those neighborhoods. So we were trying to figure out a way, collectively in this industry, how to address this housing issue, how to address these neighborhood challenges without displacing the people who live there. So affordable homeownership did seem like the answer to a lot of these problems. And initially, groups turned to down payment assistance. So that there were, for decades, there have been down payment assistance programs in our communities, some led by banks, some by local governments, some by nonprofit organizations, to help really fill that gap to get people over that hump to get into homeownership. Because, 40 years ago, the challenge to get into homeownership really was about the down payment. But today, that looks a little bit different. So if you looked back in 2005, 20 years ago, the median sale price of a house was $209,000, and a median income earning family could afford a mortgage of about 190. So you needed a $19,000 down payment assistance grant or loan in order to fill that gap. So that seemed like a very reasonable investment, right? $19,000 to get a family into permanent, stable, affordable housing that could then help them build wealth. The problem is that today those numbers look really different. And in some of our communities, they looked really different 20 years ago. So the median sale price of housing in across the country, these are nationwide numbers. In 2025 was 445,000. A median income family could afford a mortgage of about 345,000. That same down payment assistance, if it was repaid with interest, might have grown to 25,000. So you still have a $75,000 gap. So people realized along the way that down payment isn't enough anymore. And when that gap gets bigger and bigger, in my community, we are building houses that cost us right now about $600 to $50,000 a unit to build, and we're selling them for 200 or under. So that gap has grown to $400,000. But when we started this work 35 years ago, the gap was $5,000, right? So that's just one community's snapshot. So the down payment assistance of $5,000 might have worked 35 years ago, but fortunately, people had the foresight to see this coming, and instead came up with a different model. So rather than trying to fill the gap, permanent affordability looks at it from a different perspective and thinks about what if we just sold it at the affordable price in the first place? So instead of talking about affordable financing, we were talking about truly affordable housing. And one of the things that I like to make sure I highlight whenever I'm talking about this, because I work for a community land trust and we do leaseholds, and I'll talk about that in a minute, but we're not talking about taking the cost or the value of the land out of the equation because our subsidy is almost never the cost or the value of the land. So instead, we really are talking about an affordability gap. So what can low to moderate income families afford? About $345,000 for a median income family in the United States to get today. And what does it cost to actually get them in a home? And that might be $445,000. So we're going to really focus on trying to keep that 345 number alive, right? And that number is different in each of our communities, and it requires a little bit of an analysis to make sure that you get that right. And we'll talk about that much more during the practicum. So instead of, these market prices that go up and up and up and buyers' affordability that does not quite track, instead of trying to leap more and more down payment assistance to fill an ever-growing gap, we took a different perspective and thought, what if we just reduce the price to the affordable price so that our buyers can just afford what the actual price is over and over again? So the way permanent affordability works, it's sometimes also called shared equity, is we lower the price initially and then we keep that price lower at resale again and again and again. And community land trusts were the first organizations out there kind of doing this work back in the day. And since there's a big habitat crowd, I also like to kind of try to highlight that the first community land trust started in Georgia in 1969. And there's documents and photos of the folks who were starting the first community land trust hanging out on the farm with the folks who started Habitat for Humanity. So we don't know, we can't talk to those individuals anymore, but we do know that they were having conversations at the same time in the same places. And then they came up with these two really beautiful models for how to change people's lives and create access to land and housing. And for me, it's really lovely to see those two things really coming back together in today's world. So the community land trust world started in response to the civil rights movement. It was really about Black farmers being pushed off their land because they wanted to vote and things of that nature. There's more than 300 plus community land trust and shared equity programs across the country these days. It grows a lot, as I said, when there's really rapidly rising housing costs. And then every once in a while after one of these talks, someone will say, hey, there's a new CLT in Nevada. So I know I need to update my map, but you get the idea. It's big and it's growing. And then because it's growing, we do have some good data on kind of the outcomes. It used to be that we just kind of each could look at our own portfolio and talk about it, but now we can really talk about it as an industry. So 95% of the shared equity homes in that big portfolio of homes from that map are sold at prices that are affordable for people paying less than 30% of their monthly income, even though they earn less than 80% of median income themselves. We have a very low foreclosure rate as an industry. It's not just about putting people in homes, but it's keeping people in homes. So we want to make sure that we do it right, that they have the support, that it truly is affordable. And during the height of the foreclosure crisis, our foreclosure rates were 0.4% when nationwide they were 4%, even though we're serving low-income families. So we felt like that was a huge win. And then this was the biggest surprise for me in terms of data, but 6 out of 10 shared equity home buyers go on to buy market rate housing when they sell their shared equity home. In my market, I didn't think that would be an option because things are so expensive. And we kind of saw a stalling of our resales during COVID, but last year I had 4, and every one of those sellers went into market rate housing. So for the life of me, I can't quite figure out how that works, but we do see it time and time again. So it's encouraging that even in these really, really hot markets, it's possible for people to get into market rate housing when they leave our shared equity. And finally, we're doing a better job in today's world of reaching, BIPOC families. So the initial community land trusts were in, um, whiter places, and the homeowners were primarily white. And then today, it's in much more diverse communities. I work in at places, from Milwaukee to Lahaina, and or from Vermont to Lahaina, and every place in between. So we see a lot more diversity in our homeowner base, which I really am quite proud of. So, as I said, community land trusts were the ones who sort of thought of this idea in the first place. And the idea was that they were organizations with a mission to acquire and steward land permanently in the common good to create affordable housing, commercial spaces, community spaces. So, this was really the mission of these organizations. They are nonprofit, a community land trust is a nonprofit 501(c)(3) with a very specific set of bylaws. They have a defined service area, meaning there's a geography that they work within. They have a corporate membership, meaning that it's not a self-perpetuating board of directors, but the members vote on the board of directors. And then there's a tripartite board, and I'll talk about that a little bit more in a second too. But I wanted to highlight that what community land trusts are not are legally a trust. So that comes up a lot. We are not a trust in the legal sense of the word. We are not a subdivision or a project or even a program. And we are not usually a Habitat for Humanity. So I know that a lot of habitats and a lot of other organizations use this model, and that is permanent affordability and its leaseholds. And I just want to highlight that what a community land trust is an organization, but we're doing the same work as all of these other partner organizations. So that tripartite board I mentioned is important from the community land trust perspective because we wanted to make sure that leaseholders had a voice in the long term. Since we're talking about hundreds of years of control of land, the tripartite board structure gives the people who are living on that land a voice on the board of directors. So a third of our homeowners, a third of our board are made up of leaseholders or homeowners who live in our properties. So that's kind of I think the most unique part of our configuration. And then the legal mechanism that we came up with to help make this happen, I'm going to let Michelle talk to covenants and deed restrictions, but I did want to highlight the separation of title. So when a community land trust does, and what these programs that do permanently affordable leaseholds, is we sell the house to an individual along with a leasehold interest in the land, but the community land trust or the permanent affordability habitat or the NeighborWorks organization or whoever's doing this work retains ownership of the land. And then we have a 99-year ground lease that ties those two pieces of real property together. And what they create is a permanently affordable leasehold. So that represents the house and the leasehold interest in the land. So when we're talking about permanent affordability, that can apply to any type of organization. Generally, they are also nonprofits, but that includes Habitat for Humanities, NeighborWorks organizations, CAP agencies, others. Occasionally, it'll be something like a local government. I usually think that one's kind of weird because I feel like people don't want the local government owning their land, but it happens, and they do it sometimes because it is really an elegant mechanism to accomplish those goals I talked about in the beginning: housing affordability, wealth creation, and non-displacement. So again, all of us are in this room because we're here to talk about permanent affordability. What that means is we lower the price initially, and then we keep that price lower through a resale formula that lives in our lease. And that happens resale after resale after resale. So that one-time public investment can benefit generations of families and our community as a whole over decades. And the basic premise is in exchange for buying a house at a below market price, the seller agrees to limit the price at which they can sell that home in the future. It's kind of a pay it forward model. And I can remember super distinctly when I first started this work, and I thought it was genius. And then I had to sit down with the first selling family, and I was terrified. I thought this might not be as fun when you're selling a home as when you're helping someone buy a home. And I've now sat through, I don't know, maybe 80 resales or something like that. And I've had two homeowners who have been cranky about it, and I just contend that some people are cranky, right? It has nothing to do with the model, but generally, I think people feel honored to be able to pass the opportunity that was so profound for them on to another family. Um, so again, a permanent affordability could be a type of program. It's often called shared equity, and it's like the big tent, right? It includes all of us, community land trusts, habitats, gap agencies, local governments, whoever is doing this work. But along with these long-term restrictions comes long-term responsibility. So in the world of permanent affordability, we talk a lot about stewardship. It's not just about creating that initial affordability and keeping it affordable, but it's about making sure that the homes we build are durable enough to survive 100 years. It's about making sure that the homeowners we're helping get into these homes are stable and have the support they need in the event things go south later on. And then it's about stewarding the resources. So we take these public investments that have grown substantially over the course of the last, 50 years. What was a even $2,500 down payment assistance program might now be a $250,000 reduction in price in a permanently affordable home. So we really are stewarding those resources and making sure that they're there for generations to come. So I'm going to take a pause as I shift into vocabulary and terminology and see if anyone, if you have questions, you can stick them in the chat. You can also raise your hand. And if there are no questions, I will carry on with our first round of vocab. Okay, I'm going to carry on. Okay, so it turns out words really do matter. And as I said, we can, the point of this section is not to sort of, call people. I use inappropriate terminology all the time. We all do it. I just want to make sure that we're clear and that we don't make assumptions about what other people mean when they use some of these words. So we're going to start by jumping into some of the legal terms, and I'm going to pass the mic over to Michelle.
Thank you, Julie. I'm Michelle DeRosa. I know a lot of you know me, so I'm not going to go into my biography too much, but it's suffice to say, can you go back to that last slide, Julie? So I'm a lawyer, and the one before. This child, that one, under the rainbow vocabulary, was not in a first-year property law class in law school. This is never how I felt in that class. It's certainly never how I felt about vocabulary. In fact, I used to look across the room at my study partner. This is a little grim, and I used to do this with my highlighter, because the vocabulary is really, really difficult. Can you go forward a couple for me, please, Julie? And part of the reason is that this vocabulary comes from ancient England. And so, most of us read Shakespeare and it's a little challenging. Well, this is like legal Shakespeare. And a lot of these words have evolved over time. And so there are iterations, like there's lots of iterations of these concepts. So I'm gonna give you a little bit of a background on these that I'm hoping will help you understand where these come from. Okay, next. We're going to talk about fee title first, because you hear that all the time. Fee simple, fee title, what does that mean? In ancient England, as the story goes, when you were going to sell land and give it to someone else or convey it to someone else, you met in the middle of the property, and the person selling it had a bundle of sticks wrapped up, and in a ceremony, they handed those bundles of sticks to the buyer. And that was a conveyance of fee title. And what it symbolized was that there's many, many, many rights that come with fee title. And when you have a fee estate in land, you have all of those rights. And they used to be kind of unlimited by anything else. Now we have limitations on those rights. But basically, it's like the right to occupy the property, the right to use the property. You have an executory right, which means you have the right to make decisions about the property. You have the right to will it to your heirs. You have the right to rent it if you want and collect the rents if you'd like. You have the right to build things on it. And those rights have been curbed, as I said, by zoning, by restrictions, and by a lot of other things. But the general concept is if you have fee title, you own it and you own it all. So next. Let's see, next slide. How do you get fee title? Typically, you get it with a deed. A deed for a homeowner is a really important document. It's the one that proves you own your home. So when you get a warranty deed, what that means in Oregon is that there's some magic words in there, warrant and convey. And with those magic words come promises. And that's the warranty part of the deed. Those promises are about title. I promise I own it. I promise I can convey it. I promise if I'm wrong about this, I will defend your title for you. So that's a warranty deed. And in Oregon, homes customarily are conveyed by warranty deed. And often it's called a statutory warranty deed. So statutory, when you hear that word associated with these real estate concepts or real estate documents, it means that there's a law in the revised Oregon statutes that actually says, this is what that document means, this is what it has to contain. With a warranty deed, if you have statutory in front of it, you can use those magic words, warrant and convey. I hereby warrant and convey to Julie this land, and that means I'm making certain promises that are filled in by the statute about title for Julie. So a deed is what gives you title, and we can add things onto a deed, but that's the basic concept for a deed. And oh, by the way, a warranty deed is not a warranty like for your refrigerator. A ground lease, there's two reasons I see ground leases in my practice. One is when an owner is leasing land that's undeveloped or raw to someone else who wants to build on it. So I don't have a building to lease them, so I ground lease the property to them. That's one very common commercial purpose for a ground lease. In the context that we're talking about in home ownership, it means, generally speaking, that I'm going to lease you the land, and in a CLT model of sustainable or lasting affordability, you're going to buy the home that is built on that land in fee. So you have a lot more control in your fee estate over the house than you do the land. And that is a ground lease. A ground lease, as in this slide, it says it bifurcates it. In real estate law, we have even a more severe word. We say that the building or the ownership of the building is severed from the land. And a ground lease does that. It takes the ownership of the land and the ownership of the building on the land, in our case, a home, and we sever them. The homeowner is going to own and pay taxes, by the way, on the home. And the CLT or the habitat or our developer of the affordable housing is going to hold fee title to the land. And generally, they don't pay taxes, but they're the ones who have the primary control. A ground lease that has improvements on it comes with another special right for the landlord, and it's called a reversion right. A reversion means, like, at the end, if the ground lease is for 100 years, at the end of that 100 years, whatever improvements there are and whoever built them on the land reverts to the landlord. So when it's over with a lease hold or with a ground lease. What do you get with a ground lease? Next slide. You get a leasehold interest when you're the tenant or the lessee. So unfortunately, in a lot of real estate words, we have or and e as in grantor, the person who conveys the property, to the grantee, the person who gets it. We also have the words that are referred to often in leases, lessor, which is the landlord. We usually know what landlord means. That's the one who owns the property in fee. and the lessee is the person who is renting it or leasing it. So you get a leasehold estate or a leasehold interest if you are the tenant or lessee under a ground lease. In the case of the model that we're talking about of affordability, this means that you have a leasehold interest in the land, but you don't own it in fee if you're the lessee, the tenant of the ground lease. But what does that mean? A lease is a really important, it conveys probably the most important right that a fee title otherwise would give an owner. And that right is occupation. You get to be there. You get to occupy it. You get to live there. You get to exclude other people. That is the right that a lease gives a tenant, the right to occupy. And so while the landlord might go on technically owning that land, they can't occupy it, and they can't let other people occupy it, whereas the lessee or the tenant has those rights. So a lease gives up a big, like the primary right for real estate, which is to be able to use it and be on it, right? So this isn't an insignificant estate. It's not an insignificant interest that one gets from that ground lease. It's worth noting also that ground leases, at least in Oregon, are often called in this context a land lease. Ground lease and land lease are exactly the same thing. It's just nomenclature. All right, next slide. All right. So I said, like, when you get that bundle of sticks, you get all of the rights that are associated with your property. But there's certain ways that those rights can be sort of restricted or carved away. And CC&Rs, as we know them, are one of those ways. That's an instrument typically. When we're talking about CC&Rs, we're usually talking about the actual document, like a document that somebody like me writes. And the CC&Rs have covenants, conditions, and restrictions in them. And that means that it's going to curb that bundle of sticks. And basically, when you buy property that is encumbered or is affected by CC&Rs, that instrument, you're agreeing to giving up some of those rights that you would otherwise have. And that the typical common CC&Rs are that you might not be able to, have 20 cats in your yard or keep a cougar or as a pet, or you might not be able to put tiles on your roof. You have to use, asphalt tiles instead of ceramic. So there might be architectural covenants, there might be restrictions, there might be restrictions on pets, there might be restrictions on a lot of different things. A covenant, on the other hand, is like it's a promise that's already made before you buy your house. And as soon as you buy your house, and you buy your house subject to CC&Rs, you have already agreed that whatever promises are in there for a homeowner, you promise to do that stuff too. A big one, if you're in an association, is to pay assessments to the association. That's a covenant. That's a promise. You walk into the shoes of the promisee. No kidding. Promisor, promisee. That one's painful. But you walk into the shoes. You step into the shoes of the promisee. You are now the person promising to do certain things. You're going to promise to pay your assessments. You're going to promise to take care of your house. You're going to promise to keep your dog on a leash if they're out of the house, that kind of thing. So there's covenants and conditions also. Next. An affordability covenant is a very particular kind of covenant. So CC&Rs hold covenants like I promise to pay. An affordability covenant is obviously one that is going to create affordability for that home over time. In Oregon, we're really lucky because we have a statute. We have a statute that makes these enforceable. It also creates eligible covenant holders and who can actually hold these covenants. Not anybody can enforce these kinds of covenants because the state was like, well, in common law, as in coming down from ancient England, these kinds of restrictions about to whom you could sell, whether you could rent, how much you can sell it for, those aren't enforceable. So In Oregon, we're lucky because we don't have to worry about them being enforceable from our perspective. There's a statute that makes them enforceable and gives us a good definition of them. Basically, it means that we're going to suppress the price of the home on resale. And so those are affordability covenants. Those covenants can appear in a number of different documents. A really common place for them to be, dun, 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 is that ground lease and our land lease. But they can also, I think our next slide, they can also be in other instruments. A covenant, for instance, can be in an affordable housing covenant, which is just a standalone document. It doesn't lease the land, but it gives the eligible covenant holder the right to say, you can't rent it, you must occupy it, you can't sell it for more than this formula price when you go about it. Thanks, Julie. All right, a deed restriction, which is often used to describe these affordability covenants, is a close kissing cousin, but not quite the same. And it's certainly not, this is a more generic term. A deed restriction, like in the Eastern United States, that they call all covenants, affordability covenants or otherwise, deed restrictions, no matter what document they're memorialized in, whether it's in a lease, a ground lease, a land lease, whether it's in a standalone affordable housing covenant that, a seller or an eligible covenant holder in Oregon enters with a home buyer. Wherever it is, they call them deed restrictions. Technically, a deed restriction is something is in a deed, and they're not exactly the same. They have a similar process in that if there's a deed in your chain of title, like if you buy a house, this is from actually a client bought some property in which there was a deed in their chain of title, like, 10 deeds before, like generations of deeds back. This went back to 1956. My client bought this property so that they could build a cottage cluster on it. But this 1956 deed says no structure shall be erected, altered, placed, or permitted to remain on the property other than one, as in A, detached single-family dwelling. And then it says these other things about how big it can be and what kind of garage it can have. This is a problem if you are a developer. If there's a deed restriction that's in a deed in your chain of title, those don't ever die. So that deed restriction is likely to affect your title. And so you should read those when they pop up in a title report, for instance. But this one, we have to then look and say, well, who can enforce that? And usually if this deed restriction, this 1956 deed was a one-off, that owner, 50 years ago, 70 years ago now, if that owner was the only owner, then that person's long gone and it's unlikely that they can enforce it. Their heirs don't get to enforce those. On the other hand, like in this one, the whole neighborhood, I had to do a search. The whole neighborhood had exactly the same deed restriction in it. So every single person in that neighborhood had this deed restriction in it. And when they look like that, they work more like covenants or CC&Rs, in that everyone who's bound by that document, those CC&Rs, can enforce them. You could get sued for putting up two houses on this property, in other words. So that's just an FYI. Next. A deed of trust. This is such an unfortunate term, really. The other way these are known as a trust deed. In Oregon, they're most commonly called a trust deed. In Washington, they're almost always called a deed of trust. It's a three-way agreement, but at bottom, it's a mortgage. And most of us understand when you mortgage your property, you have pledged it. You have offered it up as collateral. You said, I'm going to get a loan. And the bank says, yeah, that's great, but what if you don't pay me? And this is the instrument that gives the bank the ability to take that property in foreclosure if they do not get paid when they're supposed to. So a deed of trust is not a vesting deed. It's not a deed conveying title, but it is an instrument that creates a third party, a trustee, that holds the right to take that property on behalf of the lender. The lender's usually the beneficiary. The unfortunate thing that, it gets worse with these because you could be, if you are the person that is taking out the loan and pledging the property as collateral, you could be a grantor, a trustor. You could be the borrower, and those documents use any of those terms. And if you're the lender, you could be a lender, you could be a grantor, you could be a a beneficiary is the other one. And then usually there's a title company that's the trustee. This at bottom though, it's an instrument that gives a lender a security interest in your property, meaning that that's collateral for them should you default on your loan. And I think that that's the end of my list for now.
That is, there was a question in the chat about can a true deed restriction be vacated by zoning? Or maybe you could speak to generally also how one might vacate a deed restriction of that nature, if it's possible.
So a deed restriction that unfortunately is an example of a deed restriction that is unfortunately not that uncommon in Oregon, particularly, are racial deed restrictions or racial covenants. And they say, no one but whites can live on this property. No Asians, no Chinese is what I often see. Unfortunately, no Chinese, no Japanese, no blacks. So those are unenforceable by law. So by law, they're offensive, and you see them in the chain of title, but they don't mean anything because by law they're unenforceable. A deed restriction that's like the one this was, where all of the neighbors have this in their chain of title. As a practical matter, you can't vacate them. You would have to go to every single person that's in that common scheme of ownership and get them to agree that they don't have the right to enforce this. So they're pretty serious because they don't go away. If, on the other hand, this is a one-off, it's 75 years old, there's no one you can find who's likely to be that person to enforce it. Like, they're not alive, probably, this person. And it's not something that people inherit. It doesn't run with property. On the other hand, unless there's a whole group of people that have a similar deed restriction, which is is functions like CC&Rs. That's how CC&Rs are. They're enforceable by everyone whose home is affected by that instrument. So as a practical matter, you can't really vacate them, but you can rest easy in some cases, like this one, if it were one-off and none of the neighbors had this restriction as well. I would say, yeah, there's no risk of it being enforced against you. It's not so much that it goes away, but there's little risk involved. There's more risk if other people have the same deed restriction in their chain of title.
If this was a one-off, would it show up on a title report from?
It would. If they're doing their job, it still would, because the title company doesn't want to be insuring over this anyway. Because figuring out whether it's enforceable or not is like a legal evaluation, and they don't want to be doing that. So they're going to say 1956 deed restriction, we're not covering that. Good luck with that. If it comes back to bite you, that's up to you.
I think I know the answer to this, but we did have a question in the chat from John saying to change CC&Rs requires 100% agreement, question mark. Is there a percentage that's in kind of written in law?
There is. So both under the Condominium Act in Oregon and under the Planned Community Act, the statutes indicate that sort of the baseline, the minimum that would be needed is 75% to amend CC&Rs. There's certain kinds of provisions, particularly in condominium declarations, that take 100% of the owners to agree to amend them. So like the formula for how much I have to pay, what my assessments are based on. If the documents say I pay 1/10 of the condominium's expenses, and somebody wants to change that, then every single person who pays 1/10 has to agree that it's now going to be something different, or it's going to be, based on a different formula. But for the most part in Oregon, you're going to see 75%. Occasionally, I see older CCNRs that will say 80 or 85%, but that's pretty rare. And if they say 60%, that's not going to do it. That's one of those provisions that where the law controls and says the minimum that you can that you need to amend CCNRs. A declaration is what they call them, both under the Condominium Act and the Planned Community Act. Again, a little unfortunate because we call them CCNRs, but they're really called declarations in the law. Yeah. That's you have to, there's certain laws that control over that private contract. Every set of CCNRs is basically a private contract, and the law reaches inside. It says, yeah, 60% is not enough.
I want to keep us on track, so I'm going to move us on to numbers vocabulary because I don't want to run out of time. Great questions from everybody. I'm jumping in to try to move us forward.
Okay,
Julie.
So I'm going to take the mic back and go over numbers because those are my thing. And thank you so much, Michelle. You paint it so clearly. And some of it's kooky. It's interesting. Like a lot of the community land trust history, again, is framed in this long history of legal stuff from England, and kind of many of our laws are also built sort of against those some of those institutions that existed in England. So it's always interesting to hear it circle back. Okay, but back to numbers, which I love talking about. I'm a real spreadsheet girl, love my numbers. I'm going to talk about a lot of different kinds of values. I'm going to talk about some prices, and then I'll talk about sort of some of the other terms that you'll hear us use intermittently throughout all of these trainings coming up. And again, I don't want to, this is not to say that one word is correct and one is incorrect, but we just want to be clear what we're talking about when we're using these words. So first of all, prices and values. There's a lot of variation in how we speak about this, both in just general real estate and within the world of permanent affordability. So market value. So I was an economics major as an undergrad. So I would say that the market value is what a willing seller is willing to, or what a willing buyer is willing to pay a willing seller. So nobody really knows what market value is until something's actually under contract. We also hear about fair market value, which I think is just the same thing. Fee simple value. Now, Michelle spoke about this, the fee. So in the world of leaseholds, we sometimes talk about the fee simple value to differentiate from the leasehold value. So the fee simple value would be the value of a house sitting on a piece of dirt. And the leasehold value is something different, and I'll talk about that in a minute. So again, this idea of value, so the fee simple value would be a market assessment of what the house and the land is worth. Unrestricted value is another way to say that, and some people use that terminology to distinguish from the sort of restricted world that we're working within, right? So there's what your house could sell for if it were unrestricted is different than what it might sell for given the restrictions in your lease. Appraised value is supposed to be a reflection or an analysis of fair market value done by a licensed appraiser who has gotten some education to follow some rules around looking at what things have sold for in a community and comparing those pieces of property to the property in question, and then making an educated assessment of what the fair market value is of those homes. And then assessed value is really what the sort of local treasurer's office or assessor's office would, what value they would assign to a property. So you often hear people use appraised and assessed values interchangeably, but they're often really different numbers. In many communities, assessed values lag behind market values by the nature of how they're supposed to do it. So like in Washington, they have to come out once a year, look at your property, and then change the assessment depending on what has sold in your community over that time frame, which would be different than I think in Washington, it used to be that they only came out physically once every 3 years. Anyway, so assessed value and appraised value are not exactly the same thing. The numbers are going to be different. And I think from my perspective, what's important about all of these is they're all kind of like made up esoteric theoretical numbers, because we don't really know what the market value of something is until it's actually put up for sale and you see what someone's willing to pay for it. And then the final value point I want to highlight is just that when we're talking about leaseholds, often people want to do that thing that I said we don't do, which is we don't take the value of the land out of the equation. So appraisers will sometime in one of the sections on the appraisal report call out what the land value is and then what the improvement value is if it were new construction. But I really kind of encourage you to try to get away from thinking about that distinction between land and building, because we can't have the house without the land underneath it.
Julie, does the assessed value determine your tax basis?
Yes.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. And we'll talk about that more later, I'm sure, in the actual practicum, because for all of us, like in my community, if our homeowners are having to pay taxes on a $650,000 house, which is what they're buying for 200,000, then we have a real problem. So that's another whole topic. Okay, so the next word is or term is the leasehold value. So when we worked on, one of the benefits of using the model lease when you're doing permanent affordability is that lease has been vetted by Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae. And when we had those vettings, when those happened, I feel like we're really fortunate because part of the head scratching part of this whole thing was, what is a lender's security and how is it valued? Because part of getting Freddie and Fannie to the table was it really opened the door for widespread universal access to loans for our home buyers. And if we don't have access to loans for our home buyers, we don't really have a product or a program, right? So it was a really important door to open. So I'm personally grateful to Fannie, which is a weird thing to say, but I am, for writing down instructions to appraisers on how to evaluate the value of a leasehold permanently affordable home. So what they say is, because we've all agreed in the model lease that in the event of foreclosure, the restrictions are eliminated, that they should use an unrestricted value when coming up with the valuation. So a lender, someone goes into default and into foreclosure, the lender has the right to sell the house on the courthouse steps for whatever someone will pay for it, right? It goes to auction. And so since there's no restrictions, it's whatever a willing buyer is willing to pay, right? So when they're evaluating their loan to value and kind of what the value of their collateral is, they're supposed to dismiss the restrictions and just think about if we had two identical houses side by side, one was a leasehold, one was fee simple. The only difference is the fact that one of those homeowners is paying a monthly fee for their lease. So they have a calculation based on that monthly fee to reduce the value from a fee simple valuation to a leasehold valuation. And I'll do a numbers example in a few minutes too. Okay, affordable or base price, the affordable price or the base price. This is one of these things that that people have different terms for. Sometimes people call it the effective purchase price. I think that's what's in Homekeeper. So depending on kind of what your orientation is, you might have different language around this. But the idea is that that's the number that is used to calculate your resale formula. So it's the price that the eligible buyer pays. It's the below market price. It's unrelated to market value or cost. And in an ideal world, it's based on what a hypothetical target buyer can afford in your market. So you've done some homework and you've realized that we're trying to serve this group of people who can't access housing. This is how much they earn and this is how much they can pay. So that's sort of the basis for sort of some of the initial pricing is who are you trying to serve and what can they afford? And of course, that changes over time as incomes change and as interest rate change. But that's the number, that's the affordable price or the base price that they're actually paying to purchase the home. Then the other thing is that it's important that it's adequately below market so that people will choose these homes even with the restrictions. So if it's too close, if it's 10,000 less than a market rate home, I'm going to guess that people are going to stretch, find the 10 grand and buy market rate housing rather than agree to the resale restrictions that come with our leaseholds. And what's most important is that I used to teach whole like 2-day classes on resale formulas, and I was doing that at a NeighborWorks in Portland actually years ago. And I looked out at everybody and people just, you can tell when nobody understands what you're saying. And I was just like, oh my God, nobody knows what I'm talking about. And I realized it's because they didn't understand that the price was lowered in the first place. So I'm talking about resale formulas and how to keep it affordable, but I hadn't talked about how to bring it down to begin with and how far to bring it down. So that's really what the affordable price or the base price is about. Purchase option price, that's the language in the lease, in the model ground lease, talks about Article 10 is where you calculate the purchase option price, which is the maximum price at which someone can sell their permanently affordable home. It's defined as the lesser of some sort of appraised value or the formula price. And the formula price is the resale formula that your organization has come up with to maintain affordability over time. So you'll see references to the POP or the purchase option price. And really what that is the outcome of that calculation of the lesser of appraised value or formula price. In my market, we don't run appraisals because we don't have an appraisal-based formula, and our appraisals come in at 600,000 and we're selling them for 2. So we don't have to get an appraisal to know what the lesser of is. We just do the formula price. So that might be happening in your community as well. Cost. This, I always have fun with this one when I'm in a room with a bunch of habitats, because that means really different things to all the different organizations sitting around the table. I like to define it as the actual cost to deliver a unit of housing. It might cost more than the market will bear or less. So in some communities in Milwaukee, they might be putting $250,000 into a home that has a market value of 130. Sometimes it costs more than the market can bear to deliver a unit of affordable housing, and sometimes it costs far less. Um, it's unrelated to the affordable price. It's not just what does it cost you minus how much subsidy you can bring to the table. It's what can people afford and versus the cost. That's kind of what that gap looks like. And we want to make sure that it includes the value of everything, even the value of the land that you are not selling, and even the value of the donated labor and materials, so that you know really what the true cost to deliver a unit of housing is. Those donations might vary over time. And so I really encourage folks to get the true cost. And then when you're doing your sort of spreadsheets, you can also then put in on the sources side that fact that was donated, or the fact that, it was free labor, that kind of thing. Community investment or subsidy is the subsidies that reduce the cost of the home to an affordable price for our buyers. It might be real money, so it might be a grant, for example, from the Oregon Housing and Community Services, or it might be a function of something like an inclusionary housing ordinance in your locality. So if their developer is producing below market units because they have to in order to get the density they're trying to get in any given community, and they're selling those units to you, to your portfolio, or to your buyers, there's not actually a transfer of cash to create that quote community investment, but it is a reduction in cost that creates that. That's why I use the word community investment sometimes instead of subsidy, because in my head, the subsidy are the actual dollars that you're getting from a grantor or your fundraising effort or whatever it is. And community investment is created as a result of a below market sale. So I'm going to go through a couple math equations just to kind of bring the point home that has all of these numbers wrapped into it. So value versus cost versus price. Sometimes I feel like I'm a crazy person when I start going through all of these different words. So in this example, the appraised market value of the home, the fee simple appraisal would be $442,000. The cost to deliver might be 422, so that's what it costs to build this home in this community, but it's appraising slightly higher than the cost, which is not unusual. The affordable base price, so the price that we've determined is affordable to buyers earning 60% of median income, is $212,000. And we did an analysis to figure that number out, right? We looked at what are interest rates, we made some conservative assumptions, and we backed into a mortgage calculation to figure out that 212. And there'll be a whole session on affordable pricing in our in-person training in a couple months. So the community investment is 210. So that's how much money you need to get between your 422 and your 212. So that's just to highlight kind of all of these words. How do they work on the spreadsheet? And then if we take that and we go a little bit further and think about what is the leasehold value of that. So what is the bank's security is what that question is answering. So we still have that same appraised market value of 442,000. The monthly fee is $50. So that's a $600 a month annual fee. And then the math, what Fannie says is they want the appraiser to come up with a capitalization rate. So what does a return on a long-term investment look like in today's market? And let's say it's 4%. And then the way I like to think about this is how much money would you have to invest at a 4% return to give you $600 a month of income? And that is the deduction to create the leasehold value. So you take the annual fee, divide it by the capitalization rate, and that equals $15,000. So if you put $15,000 in the bank in a high yield savings and it was paying 4% a year, you would get $600 a year. And so what Fannie says is you take that $15,000 off of the fee simple market value to get a leasehold appraised value of $427,000. Okay, I'm going to pause now and see what has happened, if anything, in the chat.
I am going to jump in. I think one of the vocabulary words that was on your initial list, Julie, was area median income,
Oh,
AMI,
yeah.
that we missed.
Okay, thank you. So let me go back to that original list and see if there's any.
That was the only one I caught that was
Yeah, area median income, you're right. Thank you. I guess that was a late addition that didn't get the slide at the end. I apologize for that. So in our, there's a lot of acronyms, a lot of lingo in our world, right? AMI, or area median income, is published by HUD, and tells us what the median income in our geography is at any given time, and then that is usually tied to the limits associated with our funding sources. So if you're using any home dollars, for example, you're limited to buyers at 80% of median income. In San Juan County, where I live, if we're using county dollars, we are limited to 115% of area median income. And I want to distinguish, sometimes I'll work in a municipality, and other resources publish median incomes. So the city has a different median income than the area median income, which is like a metro-wide data point that HUD produces. So you just have to be aware that they're different in different places sometimes, but the area median are usually metro-wide or county-wide, that HUD produces, and that's what most of the affordable housing dollars are tied to. Some folks you'll hear referred to MFI, which is median family income. And area median income is looking at a household income versus a family income. And then sometimes the census data is talking about like individual earning as opposed to household income. So it can be quite confusing when you're trying to drill down. But one of the things to be aware of on area median income is that HUD talks about, their limit is 80% of median, but sometimes mathematically 80% is not actually 80%, which also sounds like I'm a crazy person, but is true. So they have in their formula these caps that says like this can't increase by more than this per year. So eventually, mathematically, they get away from actually mathematically 80%. And if you're in one of those places, you just have to be a little extra careful to make sure that you're still in compliance and you're not serving people who don't meet the income limits that may or may not be mathematically 80%.
Thank you. I think that was really important. I also wanted to circle back with the subsidy or community investment. I think our Habitat for Humanities often have what at least Katie and I have called in the past non-cash subsidy because we're the builder, right? And
I would call that community investment, right?
Yeah, it's a community investment through Habitat, right?
Right. It's your volunteer labor and your donated materials, right?
Right.
Or it's the difference also between, it might be this $20,000 difference also in a non-habitat environment, right? Like what's the difference between the appraised value, the market value of a home you produced and what you paid? So we do want to capture all of that value when we're kind of touting how much we're bringing to the table for sure.
Yeah. I do have a question from Robin in the chat, and it says, on the affordable base price, if we have real families identified for our homes that range 60 to 80 AMI, do we select the lower AMI to set the affordable base price, thus making it affordable? Ooh, this is a complicated question here.
No, I'm going to already say yes.
I know, I'm like,
that's the answer. Yes. Yeah, I mean, from my perspective, I think that the best practices are setting like a consistent base price with the exception of product differentiation, right? So if you're building a whole subdivision and you have home buyers in the 60 to 80 range, I would price all the two bedrooms, given that the product is the same, for example, at the same price that's affordable
Right.
to your
To the
60% buyer.
60%.
And that way you have a range of
Yeah.
people who can purchase it. If you end up pricing at 79.9% and then you're wrong on interest rates, you can't, you're not compliant with hitting your target market at resale, or your sellers have to lower their price anyway. So
We do have an affordable base price calculator that does that calculation, that our
and we'll talk
Habitat for
about that.
Humanities use. And we're gonna, right, I was gonna say that's a coming up and coming,
That is,
right?
that's a whole
For that
class.
April in-person event. Katie, did you have a comment?
Yeah, I was just gonna say that remember when you're setting that initial affordable base price, you really have to think of like all the future families coming behind them. So you really don't want to have it pricing connected honestly to that initial family, since it'll impact multiple households down the line.
I have another question. Doesn't Habitat require us to use 60% of determining ABP?
I don't know what ABP
I
is.
think that
Affordable base price.
Price.
Affordable
Okay.
base price, yeah.
Watch out for those acronyms.
I think that is
But
how the calculator is set up.
I believe so as well. It might be
Yeah.
60 or 65%. I'm not sure.
I usually don't, my recommendation is never go higher than 65 if your cap is 80.
Yep, yep.
It gets more complicated when groups are serving wider ranges, like maybe
Mhm.
like we go up to much higher. But our average buyers are in the 60 range. So
Yep, that's right. Thank you. Amy, it looks like you've got your hand up. We're in Q&A mode, by the way, everyone. We've stepped into Q&A. So if you had written down some questions, or if you have some questions, now is your chance. We're officially kind of in that zone for a few minutes here. We do have you until 3:30, so we're gonna use up as much time as we can. And remember, we're not going to cover everything today. So some of it we might say, oh, that's a great question. It's coming. Amy, do you want to take yourself off mute and jump in? We can't hear you quite yet. You are still on mute.
Is that better?
Yep, thank you.
Okay, awesome. Can we go back one slide to the calculation slide?
the leasehold or the other one?
This one, yeah. No, the calculating the community investment one. Yeah. I just wanted to point out, and not to Julie because she already knows this, but that sometimes, especially in rural areas, that appraised market value cost isn't where we have to start, because it costs more. There's more investment that goes into the home, costs more to build it, to develop the land, et cetera, than what the appraised market value will bring for it.
Like those top two flipped, it would be the cost to deliver is 442 and the appraised value may be 422. For example.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, and in some, sort of depressed urban markets, it's also true, dramatically so. And then I guess the other thing I will add to this slide is that, I probably should have said subsidy and community investment as two different lines. So back to Rihanna's point about the community investment here probably should include that other 20,000, the difference between the cost to deliver and the appraised value, but the actual cash subsidy needed to produce the unit is 210. So there is that distinction, and I don't want to lose that. I do like to capture that value as well.
Yeah, thanks, Julie. I appreciate that.
Yeah, so Michelle said, I'm seeing workforce housing grants that require home sales to a bandwidth of AMI not to exceed 120 and not for households making less than 80. We serve from 50 to, our cap is $165,000 a year. So we don't even have an AMI cap. We have just a big giant cap. But our policy has been, we still price them the same, but sometimes groups end up with tiered pricing. So you might have the pricing for the under 80 and the pricing for the 80 to 120. But I often also find that in many communities, there's resources for under 80. that go away the minute you make 100 extra bucks. And so sometimes the pricing needs to be just as low for that over 80 population because they have access to fewer other resources.
Well, and that was going to be my comment as well. I think that when a lot of the folks that are in the room today are accessing Lift for Home Ownership funding, and that has a hard cap at 80%, if I'm not mistaken, AMI. So you have to watch out for your funders.
That's correct. Exactly. And that's kind of my point. So, I mean, Julie's advice about kind of shooting low is probably good, because when you, on that initial sale for 40 years with Lyft, if you blow past that 80% in a buyer's AMI, you're going to be in default on your loan, your grant. So,
Yep. So you need that space.
yeah, it's a good idea.
Yeah, and the other thing that you know, I always like to make sure people do distinguish between their own policies and their funders' policies. So for example, you might have a program that allows you to go up to 100, but if you're a habitat, you're not going to go above 80 anyway. And then, you know, so we have homes with different restrictions all throughout our portfolio, depending on which funding source we use to create that affordability.
Thank you. More questions? Either you can put them in the chat, or you can come off of mute, raise your hand, however you want to do that. We covered a lot of information today. And we do have this recording, right? We are going to share this recording afterwards, so you'll be able to rewatch some of it. I saw in the chat a couple of people like, whoa, I'm gonna have to rewatch this.
And I saw one question for Michelle earlier that I don't think got answered, but it was something to the effect of, who puts those deed restrictions in there?
Who does that?
Who does that? I mean, I think legitimately, like, it's a question. Who, like I can just, as an owner, property owner, decide to put some crazy restriction on my land. That's true, right?
Yes, actually, you can. There are some that are genuinely unenforceable, and I won't go into that. Besides racial covenants, but most of them, even the ones that are weird, like you can't have any alcohol on the property, as you may not drink wine, or I've seen you can't raise pigs, you can't have alcohol on the property, you can't, do a whole bunch of stuff. Or you must be a member of a certain church. That's another one. And you would think that'd be unconstitutional, but it's really not, because it's a private contract of private land. So there you are. Who does it? The seller, the grantor, the person conveying that deed. So, and then that's the person who can enforce them, unless they're blanketed across a whole bunch of property. And then you have a common theme of development. And suddenly all those little deed restrictions work more like CC&Rs in terms of giving everyone the right to enforce those restrictions against any of their neighbors.
So
typically it's when it was first developed, right?
Yeah, when they're first developed. I've often seen them even go like span over a neighborhood, like from the 30s to the 50s, and I'll see the deed restriction reiterated in every deed, maybe over 15 or 20 years.
We have a question from Peter Hoover. Peter,
hello. There hasn't been discussion, unless I miss it, on DTI. And DTI can impact the affordable base price calculation. And it's built into the habitat formula that it's set at 30, hardwired for 30%. We're in a scenario where I can't get, by and large, I can't get applicants who qualify at a 30% DTI, and have been encouraged by a significant number of lenders to take it to 38 or 40%. There are other producers in our region who use 40% DTI. Ginnie Mae, Fannie Mac, Freddie Mac, and others use 49.9 as the front end DTI max. And so is there any insight or thoughts that you can share, Katie, perhaps your best position on the future affordability? Because if I go to a higher DTI, in setting the affordable base price. The affordable base price is going to come out higher than the 30% that is hardwired into the Habitat supplied spreadsheet.
I'm just going to define DTI as debt to income ratio, if I'm not mistaken. So I want to just pull that acronym out a tiny bit. Katie, do you want to jump in there?
Yeah, I mean, you're exactly right, Peter. The higher you push that DTI, the higher that price goes up. So you really do have to lock in on that amount in that pricing methodology. And yeah, with the Habitat ones, it sounds like it's at 30%. I haven't looked at the calculator in a while.
Wow.
Like Proud Ground goes all the way up to 38%. I think Julie might say that's a little high.
Julie would say that's a little high.
Yeah. So I mean, lenders can do all types of things, but they're looking at their risk in that one specific loan. Whereas again, this is not about an individual person. It's really about ensuring that that base price and the get-go is low enough to sustain the affordability over
Right,
time.
which does mean that in that calculator, it might say 30% DTI, for example, but it doesn't mean that your home buyer is held to that standard. It's just used for the calculation pricing.
Good point. Yep.
So I just wanted to emphasize that there.
Yeah, I do try to stress that there is you'll have like a sort of underwriting policy for your program, or you should, that says what's the maximum ratio that's acceptable to you for individual families. Katie said hers is 38, mine is 35. Most habitats I work with say 30. And then that's a different question than what calculation are you using for pricing your homes in general?
That's right. Those are two different things.
One of the challenges.
If I may, and a third question is, do you have a grant that requires a certain DTI maximum? We were looking at a system development charges waiver or deferment, and it said affordability so the place to look in your grants or your SDC waivers is in the definition for that jurisdiction of affordable. And if it's affordable at only, what it means is affordable to certain AMI at 30% DTI.
Yeah,
that's as high as you can go.
Do you have intimate information about one of our grants based on our?
I wasn't going to say that, Peter.
And Peter, so the challenge is I've already approached the city and the URA saying that they got to get rid of the 30% DTI. Yeah.
The other, are you doing
However,
land
what I'm leading to is
yes.
we're at a point with the costs of construction and costs of land that I can't afford the subsidies. We're going to be out of business if we keep doing 30% DTI and a 65% AMI. We're gonna have to shut down.
Right, but I think again for this group, right, I want to just be careful that's a policy that you're holding as opposed to a base price calculation piece. So let's keep those separate for a minute, just because I don't want there to be confusion there. We are going to need to wrap up I want to close up questions in about 5 minutes. So if you have a burning question, now is your time to ask it.
I just want to add to Michelle's comment about local jurisdictions. They also may include different things in that DTI. So Washington State, for example, is now requiring us to include utilities in that front end ratio analysis. So those are also make it even to your point. So that is a whole separate calculation than what our policy says about 35%.
To answer the question that just came up in the chat, will the chat be saved along with the recordings? The answer is no. The recording will not reflect the chat. So be aware. That's why we're trying to repeat some of those questions verbally. And then there's another question in there. Can you please show the formula price slide again? People are apparently nerdy and numbery with you, Julie. They really want to see those numbers today. Yes,
wish I could show them the affordable price spreadsheet instead.
I know. Any other questions? If you asked a question in the chat, it didn't get answered for some reason, feel free to come off mute, make sure we didn't miss it. I think we got most of them, and some of them were repeats, so I'm kind of glazing over the repeats. We do usually save the chat, but we don't save it with the recording, which means you only get the recording when you get to refer back to this.
All right. Thank you, everybody.
Okay. Well, I think we're going to wrap is what that means. There are some items I would like to highlight. First, everybody give a hand. Yay, this was complicated. Thank you, Julie. Thank you, Michelle. Dawn and Katie as backup. This is a lot of information. So as I mentioned, we will be sending an email out with this recording. You will get this. And you will also, if you haven't already registered for our April event, Megan just dropped the registration link into the chat. That event is filling up fast. As a reminder, we are encouraging 2 people per organization to attend that April event, but we're capping every organization at 3 people to make sure that there is space for everyone. That is a hard cap, unfortunately. So please do register. We are going to hit our capacity most likely, and we're going to do that sooner rather than later. And we already are preparing a wait list, which means if you haven't registered yet, I highly recommend you do so very quickly and soon. You can get information about the April event on our landing page. I'm dropping that chat or that link into the chat right now. On that link and in that link, you will find, again, the registration link, but also you will find information about scholarships. If you haven't filled out an interest form for a scholarship, please do so. And there's more information about other perks associated with this Land Trust Practicum coming up, like the self-assessment, organizational self-assessment and document review that Julie Brunner is providing for attendees and organizations that are participating in the April event. So exciting as a perk of participation. That is also mentioned on that landing page. Is attendance in the webinars a firm prerequisite for attending the in-person session? No, we're not going to be tracking that. I don't want to have to be like, wait, did you attend those webinars? We're not doing that. You all are adults. We will be sharing these again. And we're hoping that people will watch the recordings if they weren't here in person, right? Because we want to try to get everybody on the same page going into that. And there will be some repeat information in the April event. As Julie said, sometimes we have to hear things over and over again in order for them to sink in. This is complicated stuff, right? So you will hear some things over again. And you're definitely going to hear some terms like affordable base price and resale formula and all of those things, because we're going to take a deeper dive into a lot of this information. I'm still reading chat questions here. Just in case it was missed, we can save the chat by hitting the 3 dots above the chat and selecting a save chat. You can do that right now. The other thing that I want you to do right now, before you leave today, and this is really important, is please fill out an evaluation form for this webinar. We would love to hear your feedback if this was helpful. This is your feedback informs kind of how we're going to move forward. Those organizational self-assessments are also going to inform some of our practicum curriculum in April. So your feedback is really important to us. Feel free to fill out that evaluation. It will take you about 3 minutes. And so if you click on that right now, fill it out so that we can hear from you as we go forward. Whew.
And
Our
I
event.
know, is there a place in that evaluation form where they can say, like, I'm really hoping this is going to be covered, anything like that for the...
I don't think we asked that question specifically, but since we're here and listening and everybody is opening that link right now, right? There is a comment section at the bottom of the evaluation form that's open-ended, so you can put it in there. We do have a space there. It's just not a specific question. So feel free to let us know what you want to hear about in April. I think that evaluation form is a great place to put that. I think we've covered everything today, so I'm going to stop recording